Our next speaker is Mr. John Buchanan. John has provided a wealth of information, written works, and other details that will provide us with a great deal of knowledge and I suppose an opportunity for us to take some of the words that Colin has offered about getting some value out of this particular conference. So, John, where are you hiding? Oh, there you are. Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. John Buchanan.
Thanks for the introduction and thanks for inviting me to participate in this event. The theme of catching the wave, I think, is an important one because we're at a fairly critical moment in the evolution of skills and workforce development policy in Australia. And my presentation builds on research that we've been doing as a group of researchers at my centre for about the last 15 years, and also with Lisa Wheelahan and her colleagues when she was at Melbourne University. So I'm saying it's a new way, my topic's a new way of thinking about skills, and I want to give acknowledgement to the support we've got in doing this research. It's come from the New South Wales Board of Vocational Education and Training. They supported us in the late 1990s to look at the concept of skill ecosystems, and then 10 years later to look at the idea of moving from a notion of competence to a notion of capability in thinking about vocational skills. The Australian Education Union commissioned us to look at education and how it could help respond to the GFC. The AQFC, the Qualifications Framework Council, got us to do an analysis of how the new framework would impact on education and the labour market. And the NCVR has very generously backed us over 3 years to look at these questions. Can I say none of them necessarily supports anything I am about to say. So they have been very generous in their funding, and not only generous but incredibly open in not standing over us and saying you should conclude this. We've had complete freedom in what we wanted to argue. I've listed there the research colleagues who've worked with us, and most of them will support what I'm about to say. So, what do I want to talk about? Well, I thought I'd kick off because the issues of the relationship between skills and work and education are quite complicated, and I'll just kick off with 3 little case studies of the vision of education and work that I have in mind. That's in fact inspired by the kind of biblical mode that you use a parable. So there'll be 3 parables to kick off with. Then I'll have an assessment of what do we have, and I'll talk about basically we've got a VET system with some strengths but multiplying problems, and then I'll outline why. And essentially, in a nutshell, our argument is that the current system fragments the development of human capability, and this leads to a limited capacity for individuals to respond to a rapidly changing and uncertain situation. So how do we get to a better place? We as researchers argue that we've got to rethink what does it mean to learn in industry, to learn for industry, and to learn about industry. And current arrangements don't do any of those things well. And then why can this analysis be trusted? Well, these are not just opinion pieces that we've written in a series of newspapers. We have been researching this in depth for about the last 15 years. So what do we want? What's motivating us as a research team in looking at these issues? And I'm going to open with the 3 little case studies. There's a very useful book called Practical Wisdom. It's taking the philosophy of Aristotle and outlining how it can help you live your life better. And the opening part of that book starts off with a case study of a hospital orderly. This is a cleaner in a hospital in the US. And the story goes that the researchers who were interviewing this guy were trying to understand how people made sense of their lives and how work was integral to making sense of their lives. And this hospital orderly said, well, let me give you an example of what happened to me today and how my work is really important to the operation of this hospital. And he said there was a father who had been coming into the hospital for the last 3 months, sitting by his son who had been comatose after having a street fight. And that father went off his brain at me that day. He'd attacked the cleaner and said that the cleaner had not cleaned his son's room. And the cleaner had systematically worked down the ward, and he knew that he'd just gone into every room, cleaned it, walked out, moved into the next room, cleaned it. So he knew that he had cleaned the room. Clearly the father hadn't been there when that had happened, and he was honestly mistaken. Now the cleaner instant reaction was to jack up and say he was going to pull his supervisor in and get the issue sorted out. But the cleaner changed, and the cleaner thought, what's going on here? And the cleaner said, well, essentially here's a father who's been helpless for 3 months watching his son basically rot away. And he said, I as a cleaner let that father have a victory and say, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry I didn't clean your room. I'll do it now. And in that way, the cleaner was playing a social support role. He was not just there getting dirt off the floor. He was part of the care regime of that hospital. And I think that's a very powerful way of thinking about what we're getting at when we're talking about capability. You don't have a competency standard for empathy. You don't have a competency standard for understanding the total notion of a care system, but that cleaner had a sense of his place in that work situation and what it meant to be a capable orderly. Second example I want to give is a personal one. My father was a maintenance engineer in the Royal Australian Air Force, and in 1965, as part of de facto support for the American bombing raids on Vietnam, he was sent to a base called Hobart in the Thai jungles. Australians didn't send fighter aircraft into Vietnam at that stage, but they provided support. One night when my dad was up there at Hobart, a desperate maintenance manager from the American side of the base came across and said, do you have a ladder mechanic? And Dad said, no, we don't have ladder mechanics in the Australian Air Force. And he said, why? And he said, well, I've got 5 Thunder Chiefs sitting out there on the runway. Now, for those of you who may or may not know, a Thunder Chief is the equivalent of a B-17 in 1965. It had as much payload as a B-17. It could fly at twice the speed of sound with one pilot. He had 5 of them sitting idle on the tarmac because all the ladders that were required to get to the engines were broken, and his ladder mechanic was sick. And Dad said, I don't have a ladder mechanic, but I do have a welder. Maybe the welder could fix your ladder. And the ladder mechanic, and then the US maintenance orderly said, that would be fantastic, that would be really good. So this is a second example of how the American Army, built around the competency-based training system, didn't have somebody who understood the capability of working with metal at large, but only understood the specific competencies required to fix ladders, was really impairing the war effort. As I said to Dad, this was an objectively a bad thing because the Vietnamese suffered a lot worse because of Australia's well-rounded, skilled tradespeople. The third example I want to give is in the vocational education. And one of the most powerful experiences I've had in about the last 5 years is when I went to America. A colleague of mine, David Feingold, said, I want to take you to one of the best high schools I've ever visited. And I have to say, I was a sceptic. But this is a place that's called Bergen Academy. Now, Bergen Academy was what used to be what we would have called a technical high school. But as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, it was a failing high school, a technical high school. It was down to 70 students. Now, you don't have to be Einstein to work out that a high school with 70 students in it doesn't have much of a future. Now, a group of teachers got together around this school and they said, we're going to revitalise this school, but we're not just going to patch it up. We're going to completely rethink the curriculum. We're going to make a notion of vocational education absolutely central to every subject. So the maths department was linked to the engineering employers in the district. The science department was linked to the research groups within the hospitals in the locality. The economics department had links with Wall Street in New York because this wasn't too far. It's just on the New Jersey side of the border there. So all the curriculums were coordinated with the employers in the district. Now the punchline to this story is, not only had they revitalised the curriculum, they had turned this into such a high status school that parents were queuing up to get their students into this school. It was such a high performing academic institution that it was, I don't know if you have them in Tasmania, but we have selective high schools in Sydney and Melbourne. It had the status of Sydney Boys High or North Sydney Girls High. And so this had gone from a failing high school to the go-to school in the state, based around the notion of vocational education. But it wasn't vetting schools tacked onto the side of a competitive academic curriculum. It was actually taking a notion of vocation and making it integral to the whole education offering. So that's when we're talking as researchers where we've got this broader vision. We've got a vision of cleaners and orderlies who don't just see themselves as a marginal part of an organisation but see them as integral to a care regime. We're thinking about maintenance workers who have rounded skills and not specific anatomised skills, and we're thinking about vocational education in the broadest possible sense, not as something that's an afterthought to the academic curriculum. So what do we currently have when it comes to VET? Well, basically VET reform has had some notable achievements. The most significant one has been the integration of all state systems into a national system. This is not something to be sneered at and is something very hard to achieve. But there are three fundamental paradoxes that afflict the system. The first is that VET qualifications have expanded endlessly over the last 10 or 15 years. Take one example from agriculture. There are 106 different Certificate 2 and Certificate 3 quals for a part of the labour market that accounts for about 2.5% of employment. That's just ag. When you aggregate this up across all training packages, you are talking about thousands of qualifications. And here's the punchline: the connections between work and qualifications have got weaker. So the argument was you had specific quals that would go to specific parts of the labour market. Tom Carmel's produced that knockout data, how vocational is VET, and at best you're finding about half these people are working 6 months later in the part of the labour market they've trained for. So there's this complete disconnect, plethora of qualifications, disconnect from the labour market. Second paradox is, whilst employers are often quite noisy about talking about skill shortages, complaints of skill underutilisation still persist amongst the workforce at large. So employers aren't getting what they're getting and getting what they want, and neither are workers getting the jobs they want. And whilst VET is conceived as a space for vocational development, universities are moving further down the quals hierarchy and into the vocational space. So this is a very unstable situation. There's a problem with the qualifications, there's a problem with skill use and demand, and there's a problem with the relationship between VET and higher ed. Why is this the case? We think there are fundamental design flaws in the current structure of the VET system. It has three wrong starting points. Firstly, it starts with current jobs. Competency standards are derived from an assessment of current arrangements. Secondly, there is an assumption that individuals are generically employable. And there's thirdly a linear vision of pathways, and these can be mapped out using relatively unconnected competencies. So let's just think about that. We focus on current jobs, we have a vision of humanity that can be basically picked up and deployed anywhere, and a linear vision of pathways. These are unhelpful building blocks for actually building what we need for the economy today. Our analysis has shown that the problems are not primarily in the education system but within the labour market itself. There are deep problems of segmentation in the labour market, and I'll take you through that in a minute. And it's important we grasp these problems in the labour market, because too often education people like to whinge about those evil universities are condescending to VET. Now, some universities are elitist. I don't take any notion away from that. But the relationship between VET and higher ed is of second order compared to the problems in the labour market. So we argue that better tools for understanding and engaging with reality has to start with individuals. We don't start with current jobs, we start with the individual. What will it take to give those individuals and the workplaces they work in the ability to navigate an uncertain future? I can't tell you what the economy is going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time, but I can tell you it's not going to look exactly the way it is today. How do we equip individuals and workplaces to navigate those transitions? That's the place where we should be starting. And in doing this, we build on Sen's notion of human capability, but Sen has pitched this idea at a very high level of abstraction. We argue that human capability has got to be refined for particular domains of vocational expertise. And the kind of domains we think about are care work, engineering work, logistics, animal and land husbandry, business services. But those vocational streams don't just sit free-floating. They have to be designed around communities of trust, the stakeholders who've got an interest in them. So I'll elaborate on each of these issues in turn. So how does the current situation persist? Let's look at how linear pathways are formulated in current policy, and then make a judgment about how they actually play out in practice. I did my PhD on the metal and engineering sector, and I studied very closely the reforms that played out in the 1980s and 1990s, some might say in excruciating detail. So my life was built around looking at that reform initiative which had the vision of turning a trades assistant into a trades worker, having their capacity to turn into an engineering technician and then become a degree qualified engineer. That vision of a career path was inspiring. I'll declare a bias here. I was a union delegate who argued in mass meetings for wages policies to support those reforms of the awards system, of the training system in the 80s. But it wasn't just confined to the metal and engineering sector. Similar visions of career paths are implicit in nearly all the awards regulating the Australian labour market today. And in the research we've done for the Qualifications Framework Council and for the NCVER, we've looked at the supposed linear flows in finance, from General Clerk, Loan Officer, Financial Dealer to Investment Manager. In the care sector, we looked at flows from PCAs to enrolled nurses, RNs, and then to health administrator. And in ag, we've looked at the flow from farm worker, farm operator, ag technician, and then on to farm manager. Now, how has this... That's the theory. What's the reality? In fact, one of my favourite poems is T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, and he's got a great line in that, between the conception and the reality falls the shadow. And when it comes to labour markets and workforce development today, we're living in a very dark shadow indeed, because this is what we've got. Now, it looks pretty odd, so I'll explain what's going on here. We, as a group of researchers, and Serena Yu, my colleague, has done all this, have taken the HILDA analysis, the HILDA dataset, and HILDA is the Household Income Labour Market Dynamics of Australia survey, and it's like the film 7 Up. You know, 7 Up goes back to the same people every 7 years. It's what's called longitudinal. HILDA goes back to the same household every year, and we've got 10 years of data here. So what it allows you to do is you can trace an individual's path through the labour market. Now, each of those little lines is an individual, and they're colour-coded, and we've got there what the codes mean, whether someone's studying at school, studying vet, higher ed, what are their occupational groups. We've done this for the 4 sectors I looked at, and this is the data from ag. So if you look on your left-hand side, that's farm managers, and that big chunk of bluey green, I'm slightly colourblind, so it's the one where there's the big chunk in the middle. That's farmers. Basically it says if you start a farmer, you finish a farmer, or you move essentially into some kind of farming occupation. The second diagram is a very colourful, almost like a patchwork quilt. That's showing the manual workers in agriculture, and that's basically showing lots of churn, lots of lateral churn. They're not moving up, they're not going from farm hands, you know, to farm supervisors, to agronomists, and then on to farmers or whatever. They're basically churning between low-level labouring work, machinery operator work, spells of unemployment. And that's the reality, that whilst we have a vet system and a labour market which assumes linear pathways, we in fact have deep segmentation. People basically go into one echelon and stay there. There's very little movement up. And where within those segments there is significant churn. Now, what we did find, because I've got an interest in the metal industry reforms, we have the capacity, and we've done the same in the metal industry, and you find the same. Trades workers essentially stay trades worker, process workers move between process work, basic labouring and the like. We did, through our own data set, we've been tracking 8,000 workers for 5 years. We did find 3 people who had actually followed the linear career path, and we could phone them up. And we said, how did you do it? And every one of them said, don't let anyone else ever embark on this path. I would never recommend it to them. It nearly destroyed my family life. Almost the same interview 3 times over. So not only was a linear path hard to pull off, but basically assumes that you use all your discretionary time to make the leap from process worker to trade, and then from trade to technician, and then from technician to degree qualified. So that's a second design flaw in that system. Formal flow is possible, substantive flow is almost impossible unless you're prepared to compromise significant other parts of your life. So these are the situations we have. Deep occupational segmentation, where there's basically high skills trajectories. That's like in the area of the farmer, low skill trajectories, and then there's a big group that is marginally attached who have large spells of unemployment. So how do we make sense of these facts? Well, I was trained as a labour economist. My first training is in history, but I went back to do economics because no one employs historians. And I had Bob Gregory, who was a very famous labour economist, and he made the simple but very powerful point that the labour market is more like a river than a lake. That when we think of labour markets, we often have a static view in time. That's our vision of work. But in fact, we should be thinking more of flows. And so I said, well, we've got this data. How are we going to make sense of these flows? And maybe, and sorry, these are all very New South Wales examples initially. I should have customised them to Tasmania, but this is Warragamba Dam in Australia. And maybe you could argue that the segmentation is like a river that's been dammed up and there's little leakages out, just small little leakages. The underlying story is the dam. But the problem with the dam analogy is that it misses that dynamism. You might remember there was lots of colour. The people weren't just stuck in one spot, they were moving around. So maybe it's more like the billabong. Maybe there's a deep underlying continuity, but people get segmented off. But that misses the story too, because the segmentation is not static. So I had to turn to New Zealand for the graphic that really made sense of it, and that's the Braided River. Now, New Zealand is geologically a lot younger country than Australia, and its rivers on the South Island have not really settled in a stable geological formation. So as the water changes in volume, the nature of the rivers change. And the beauty of these, and this is a bit like the delta, you would have seen deltas, the Nile Delta and the like. And the beauty of this is that it captures both coherence, segmentation and flow. And I think this notion of the Braided River captures far more the nature of both continuity and stability, but also significant variability in the way in which people flow through the labour market. But it doesn't end there. People don't just flow through the labour market, they also flow out of the labour market. So when a baby's born, often women leave the labour market, or somebody will take time out from work and go out and study. And so these are exits from the Braided River. The really interesting policy challenge is, how do you get back in to the river? And this is a very hard thing indeed. And so when we're thinking about policy, I think we should be thinking about working with the Braided River. What kind of canals do we put in? How do we work with this, not how do we deny its existence? So this is the basis around which we define vocational streams. This is why we use the term stream, because it's looking at flows. And for us, a vocational stream is a set of occupations linked by common knowledge, skills and capabilities within a broader field of practice. We haven't been commissioned to look at this on an economy-wide basis, but from our research over many years, the kind of things we have in mind of vocational streams are care work, financial services, logistics work. And can I say, I use logistics work quite deliberately there and not manufacturing work. If you go to a manufacturing plant these days, they're structured around Kanban systems and the like, and they're part of a logistics flow. And this is what we're saying when we're thinking about vocations. We're not just thinking about the standard ABS industries, we're not thinking about the standard ABS occupations, we're thinking about how skills cohere in ways that are kind of intuitively understood by people but not captured by the ABS. So as I said, there's care work, financial advice, logistics, engineering, animal and land husbandry and customer service. Now, what we want to argue is why would you even bother thinking in this way? Well, we would argue that if you started to develop people in a broad notion of vocation, you increase their capacity to adapt. So instead of giving someone a certificate 2 in how to install a muffler on a car, which is one of the certificate 2s that you can get out of the auto industry training package, that's not very helpful, because you're probably not going to work the rest of your life putting mufflers on cars. If you brought it back to a more general skill, around logistics, say, you then create the capacity of that individual to be more rapidly redeployed more effectively in a range of industries. So the key issue then becomes, how do we craft these vocational pathways for the benefit of all? Now, we would argue that there are two fundamental issues that have to be addressed to define a vocational stream. The first is mapping out what are the commonalities in capabilities. As we've said there, we need to identify linkages and overlaps between skills and knowledge underpinning a broad scope of practice. Let me give you a couple of examples. For the New South Wales Board of Vocational Education and Training, we've been looking at the notion of care work, and we've been looking at how there's a deep common notion of care in both aged care and disability support, and even in some cases mental health support. So instead of having specialised quals in aged care, disability support and mental health, maybe we can look at an underlying capability. Now, can I say community service and health has been better than most other industry training packages because they have spent more time bundling together competencies. We're just simply saying that there's maybe a need to keep the process up and look at this underlying notion of care capability. This is an idea, for instance, that didn't come from us as researchers. The New Zealand employers actually embraced this as an operational principle about 10 years ago, because as a matter of critical mass, they didn't have enough people to justify having specialised aged care or disability support. They said, let's actually look at building up a stock of care workers who can be rapidly deployed between aged and disability services. We've looked at a similar approach in the agricultural sector, looking at a notion of rural operations, which means somebody can be deployed around construction, local government and different parts of ag. So that's the first thing. You need to identify what are the commonalities and capabilities. The second thing that's important for building a vocational stream is identifying social partner readiness to cooperate and build a community of trust that will define these capabilities and help develop them. Now, what we've done in our 4 sectors, we've looked at finance, agriculture, engineering and health, and we've plotted them on what's their ability, what's their potential for moving to developing basic vocational streams. And on the vertical axis, we've said there's social partner readiness to cooperate and make this work, and on the horizontal axis we've said what's the commonality and capabilities that could be brought together. Now, engineering is currently characterised by a huge degree of goodwill amongst all the parties, and we've worked with the Australian National Engineering Task Force, ANET, and that's got the consulting engineers, the Deans of Engineering, the Academy of Engineering, APESMA, the union in there. It's got basically anyone who's anybody associated with engineering, and they're very keen to try and bring up and elevate the status of engineers. But within their core domain, they argue that the requirements for a construction engineer or a civil engineer are deeply different to an electrical engineer. So whilst there's a high lot of goodwill wanting to bring a stream together around engineering, they're just saying the inherent nature of the profession is one that requires significant specialty and leads to low ranking in terms of commonalities of capabilities. Health, on the other hand, is in a very different boat. In the health area, there are many capabilities in common, but it's probably the best organised division of labour in the country. I mean, in fact, the division of labour in health is colour-coded. If you go to a hospital, you see people in different colours uniforms, and they have different occupational unions. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it actually means, whilst there's often a deep commonality in capability, the way in which that is carved up is quite complex, and it means that the preparedness of social partners to come together and rationalise that is difficult. Ironically, the industries which seem to be best placed to take these ideas forward are agriculture and finance, where there's both a high degree of capabilities in common and a high degree of social partner readiness to negotiate the change. So, can I just give some examples of how this might work? Within agriculture, there's a fledgling example based on only very small numbers, but it's a very interesting example where the cotton farmers in Narrabri had a major problem with eliciting the labour supply they needed, particularly at harvest time. And this demand for labour only existed, I think it was for 5 or 7 months a year. And they realised that they had trouble eliciting that labour they needed. They needed to cooperate with other employers in the district. And so they got together with employers from construction and local government and said, between us we can probably offer jobs over a 12-month period. And so somebody might work in cotton for 6 months, construction for 4 months, and then local government could use its scheduled maintenance program to fill the gap. Now, this notion of coordinating labour demand was done around the basis of a Certificate 3 in rural operations. So once again, this is a notion of capability that straddles any one industry, that conveys to you the idea that people can be redeployed pretty quickly because they're not simply trained to be a cotton picker or trained to be a construction support worker or a local council maintenance worker. They were looking at rural operations, basically underlying skills needed to be a plant and machine operator and all the allied work that goes around that. The key success factors here have been that there's an ecosystem which is coordinated around the local council. Local experts have been supportive of it, and there's been ad hoc but ongoing funding. Can I say most of this has flourished independently of, not as integral to, current funding models. And that's the real irony. Many of the examples I'll be giving you are not a function of the current VET funding models. They operate despite, not because of them. Now, this is one for the kind of labour market researcher tragics in the audience. It's how you can rethink labour supply and labour demand using these categories. I won't harp on this. We can come back to it in question time if you like. But it basically says, using Sen's notion of capability, you can think about labour supply as having 3 levels. First of all, there's the deep capabilities that everyone's got to have to function in society. And Sen, as you may or may not know, is a development economist, and he's particularly interested in people getting enough calories every day and having shelter over their heads. So the deepest capability of all is having food and shelter. But if you're going to function in a more holistic way, you've got to have capabilities in terms of education, and in what we're saying, this is where we're rounding out Sen's notion, capabilities in particular vocations. But we're not mechanistic. We don't say once you sign up to the care vocation, you're stuck there for life. People have careers, so you might be a carer for some time, but you might also be involved in logistics for another. So that's how labour supply evolves from the deep underlying conditions through the capabilities and into particular careers. When it comes to labour demand, we think employers could define what they need in terms of drawing down on the underlying expertise that they need. So in the case of the Air Force, the Americans said what we needed was a ladder mechanic. In the case of the Australian Air Force, they said, no, we need good metal fabricators. Then if you move out of, say, the metal fabrication area, you can move into a specific occupation, which would be, say, stainless steel fabrication, and then that would lead to a specific job, which would be, working on fighter aircraft. So you can use these categories to rethink supply and demand. So how do we actually get to a better place? What does this actually mean in a practical sense? Well, we think fundamentally there needs to be a tighter way of thinking about learning in industry, for industry and about industry. The first thing, and I thank Kay Schofield for this expression, is that Australian training policy has been predicated for about the last 20 years on the assumption that most workplaces are cathedrals of learning. And we question that assumption. We basically take our lead from the health system. Not every hospital is a training hospital. And we think it's time to have a debate in this country about how we support the workplaces that take training and education seriously, and just don't assume that any employer that puts their hand up is worthy of support. Now, I'm not trying to drive employers out of the system, but we're saying those that take it really seriously deserve serious support. The second thing is we've got to have learning for industry. People can't be infinitely flexible. You can't train someone in generic problem-solving skills. Problem-solving on the platform of an oil rig is very different to problem-solving in the playground of a childcare centre. They're both problem-solving, but a highly degree qualified engineer from an oil platform I wouldn't want to let loose in a childcare centre. That's not because I don't like oil platform engineers or people from that sector, but handling 3-year-olds is complex business. And similarly, I wouldn't want to have a childcare worker trying to get oil out of the ground. You know, you've got to have context taken seriously when you're looking at these underlying skills. And that's what we mean by learning for industry. It's getting broad skills in a specific setting. And a key issue here is having underpinning knowledge. A key problem with the competency standards is that they assume everything will be written to the competency standards. We're saying, no, if you're to flourish as an individual in society, you've got to have an underlying understanding of what you're looking at, and that just doesn't come from an aggregation of competencies. And finally, there's got to be learning about industry. People have a natural curiosity. You just got to look at newsagent stands. Who Weekly's a top seller? They want to know what's going on in the world. Unfortunately, they want to know most of the wrong things about what's going on in the world, but there is a natural curiosity out there in the population. We should be harnessing that curiosity and bringing it into the vocational education system so that people have that curiosity developed about what's going on in their work around them. So, what are some specific suggestions? Well, I think we've got 4 listed here. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Lisa and I are not saying tear the current system down and start again. You work with the infrastructure as it is, and you go with the flow of the labour market. I showed you those examples of the Braided River. Let's look at the Braided River. Let's work with it. Let's build canals. Let's put in dams. Let's put in dikes. You don't try and blast your way through it and impose that linear model. You look at what's there and you work with it. There's got to be a high level of engagement with local experts, and that's the beauty of the Narrabri example that I gave you. You've got to look at new ways of defining roles, because this is not easy. I'm giving you the insights that come from years of research. There are major differences of interest here. You know, in the health system, you know, doctors and nurses have a, fragile relationship. That's going to have to be handled with extreme care. Doesn't mean change can't happen, but you're going to have to think about models of care. And those models of care are there, such as interdisciplinary clinical service networks, which define the problem differently. It's not how do we dilute the skills of doctors so nurses can do more. If you pose the question that way, you're going to get run over by the AMA. But if you pose the question of how do we look after acutely ill, frail, aged people in Sydney, what are the disciplines we need to do that? When you put everyone in the room, they usually come up with answers that we're going to have to share our skills, and that's been documented in Sydney. So it's not impossible, but it takes some original thinking on how to get through the barriers. And finally, there's a need to think about what's the role of large corporations and regions in this. Large corporations often have internal labour markets. Funnily enough, we found of all the 4 industries we studied, the finance sector does this best. They often work with tacit vocational streams, but you've got to craft the changes in a way that's sympathetic to their business models. And similarly, when you're dealing with agriculture and health, the locality in the region is a natural organising unit. So what's the conclusion? Sorry I haven't updated these slides, because when I first gave this presentation I said it was time for VET to shake off its inferiority complex, and the inferiority complex comes from accommodating schools and higher ed. VET's the kind of thing you do when you can't fit it into schools or universities. Now that's not a very helpful way of thinking about things, and you've got to stop having this notion of accommodating the short-term needs of employers. But I was wrong. I mean, VET doesn't have an inferiority complex. There's a big current in the VET system that has a Panglossian complex. Voltaire wrote a book called Candide before the Great French Revolution, and Dr. Pangloss has said, we live in the best of all possible worlds. Well, there's many people in the VET system who think we live in the best of all possible worlds. That is a huge barrier to thinking through what actually needs to be done, because I don't think we are living in the best of all possible worlds, and if we drop that Panglossian view, a whole lot of possibilities open up. I think it's time for those committed to vocational development to note that it is about a new vision for economic and social renewal. We've had this mantra that we've got to have the right skills at the right time for the right place. Wrong ambition. Wrong ambition. You've got to have people who are capable of responding to an uncertain future. That's a very different objective. So basically we need a notion of vocational development as integral to economic and social renewal. We provided some pointers for you. We don't have the complete answers, but we would argue if you don't start on this journey now, when are we ever going to start? The potential for major gains are serious, and I look forward to debating the issues with you. Thank you.
So, John.
John, you're open for a few questions. So are there any questions of the good professor while we've got him here?
I am at dinner, but ask questions now too. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike O'Loughlin, CEO with Wodonga TAFE. I'd just like to put the proposition to you that the basic foundations of the vet system in Australia have passed their use-by date. The concept of training packages that you're basically attacking there, I think, is very valid. That the very high fragmentation of skills and qualifications is no longer appropriate to where we are, and people in Tasmania are probably a bit shocked by this, but where we live in a very highly contestable environment, we're now running up against these issues of just in a contestable environment, people are gaming the AQTF system to get the maximum dollar return by doing all sorts of creative solutions to packaging up training programs. And this is counterproductive in the sense of, I'm sorry I'm commenting here, but counterproductive. We have an example of we have a program called Outdoor Works that cuts across 3 qualifications. The Victorian government said because people were gaming it, can only do 2, which completely stopped our Outdoor Works program. And the other issue, I think, coming up in this is the contestable market. That's even going to be a greater threat to this, that this qualifications framework is fine in the traditional system. As soon as you come up into a highly contestable market, you're really creating all sorts of issues. And now with Kemp Norton coming along, even more so. Do you agree that the VET system is basically past its use-by date?
Can we maybe take a couple of questions, because I've had a good run in talking, and then I'll respond to a group. I'm happy to. I will answer your question, but I think it's better if we can get a bit of engagement with the audience. Is that okay?
Hello, I'm Val Kitchener. I'd like to know if there are any points of divergence in what you've been saying with regard to students who might be in an equity group. And I'd particularly like you to comment if you would apply that wonderful phrase that says there is a natural curiosity out there in the population to people in those equity groups. Thanks.
And one more.
I'm Mike Brough, TAFE Board. John, you emphasised adaptive capability as a key start, or perhaps the key starting point in preparing people for the world of work. It is clear, though, that technical knowledge and skills are highly important and are highly valued in the workplace. I'm just wondering whether you have some views about how, in practice, adaptive capacity can be coupled with the development of specific learning in a learning context.
That's a great question. Look, I'll answer those questions in turn, if that's okay. So the question from Mike and Wodonga TAFE, Lisa Willerhan and I have argued incredibly intensely around this question about whether the VET system has passed its use-by date, and we now have reached a consensus position that the problem with VET policy in Australia, and I'm using your Keep's phrase here, is it's been regarded as the biggest train set system in the world. You just pick bits and pieces up and you shift it around, and it's been the plaything of people who basically know nothing about vocational education. And it's been damaged immeasurably as a result. And so instead of us advocating yet again another root and branch change, we think you've got to work with the current structures as you have, but configure them completely differently. So let's take an example. That example of the Cert 3 in rural operations was based on looking at what the cotton industry, construction and local government sectors needed in Narrabri. And they thought we need, in a sense, a well-rounded person at essentially trades level who could use a variety of equipment, could maintain a variety of equipment, understood the basic physics and engineering around it. And That was all done in the current system. They worked out what they wanted and then they mapped the competencies onto it. So instead of starting with the competencies, instead of starting with a cotton picking job and then mapping the competencies of that, they said, no, we need this capability in the district. To get people with that capability, how can we elaborate on that using the competency standards? So if you like, it's advanced reform as opposed to root and branch transformation. That's kind of what we're advocating. I would actually, I think the training packages can be modified to that effect. Where I will be blunt, and I think I'd be interested in your views on this, I think the funding models are fundamentally flawed. Basically, the VET system now is populated by organisations that feed off funding models. We don't have a funding model that engages with labour demand. We have training suppliers who look to the funding model. And we've got to think very differently about how we configure the flow of funds so that it works with labour demand. Those examples I gave you from Narrabri, I've done a lot of work in the dairy industry. Like, the dairy industry's got sick and tired of they've been collaborating very creatively. They've given up. They've taxed themselves. Right, they've levied themselves. That's the depth of employer estrangement from the demand-driven system. And so to have open warfare on the training packages would be a big step, and we're not going there. We think you can work with them, but we are actually going into open warfare on those funding models because they are not engaging with reality. They're doing significant damage to reality, particularly labour demand. And so that's, if you're going to pick your fights, we'd rather pick our fights with the funding model than the training package. But that's a judgment call. You know, there's a lot of science on that, but happy to talk about it. The issue of disadvantaged students is a good one. Lisa, I'm the labour market guy on this, and my centre's a labour market. Lisa's an educationer, and she's very strong on looking after disadvantaged groups. Our vision here, as I opened with Bergen Academy, is that you've got to stop VET being in the ghetto, right? There is nothing second-rate about vocationalism. And we don't think you should say anyone who's successful in life has an academic education and the second-raters get VET. We're trying to have a notion of vocation that is open to all. And within a vocation, people can come in at different levels, but they're part of a care vocation, they're part of an engineering vocation, they're part of a logistics vocation. And we would see that as open to disadvantaged people as others. But to solve the problems of disadvantage, you can't solve it through curriculum reform. You've actually got to have other support structures. Often the problems require the integration of social policy interventions as well as education interventions, right? And this is why, you know, with that rural operations, you can, and I've talked to people in group training companies about this, what you can do if you've got a good system of, say, that labour demand, you've got employers lined up. I've seen this in group training companies. A good group training company will guarantee a 25% rate of return to any employer then hires their group training employee. The employees queue up for that, and what the good group training companies do is then nestle in a disadvantaged person 1 in every 10. So they don't run it as a labour market program to look after the disadvantaged. They have deep engagement with the employers, and on the basis of that get access. And I think that's the thing. You've got to have deep employer buy-in, and that then gives you the framework for drawing the others in. As for the natural curiosity of the disadvantaged, look, I haven't worked with them for a long time, but I did do a lot of work, showing my age here, as a CIS volunteer back in the 70s, you know, the Community Youth Support Scheme. And what I did notice about even the most marginalised people is that they take a great interest in football and pets and, you know, graffiti. They're creative. They're just curious about different sorts of things, and you've just got to harness that natural curiosity. Most people want to know what's going on around them. So I don't think there's only curiosity at the upper parts of the labour market. I think that's across the board. Now, Mike from the TAFE board's raised a really important issue, and it's a critical one. For us, there's no opposition between adaptive capacity and technical skill. In many ways, we're trying to elevate the notion of technical skill so that it's more transferable. At the moment, there's a vision. You've got your generic skills up here, and you've got your specific competencies over there, and anyone who's generically skilled can pick up these competencies there and do it. We say wrong. We say wrong. Somebody who works on an oil platform is probably not going to be very good in a childcare centre, and vice versa. So you've got to give them deeper capabilities. They mightn't always work in a childcare centre, but they might be good in aged care or mental health services or flick across to some other part of the care domain. Similarly, the engineer on an oil platform might be out on an oil platform for all their lives, but they might be good in other parts of engineering. So it's that transferable technical capability that is of deep interest to us. And that's, if you like, what used to inform notions of trade and notions of profession. But what we're trying to do is define those categories in a more open way. Trades and professions were often defined in a very exclusory way. We're trying to get a notion of occupational coherence that isn't exclusory, it's more expansive. This is difficult. I'm not saying this is easily done, but that's the space we're trying to carve out. Okay? Good. Other questions or comments? And please, I'm used to being criticised, guys. I've been criticised by the best of them, so it's better to have a vigorous debate than just polite agreement.
Stay around too long, I'll have to criticise.
Okay, sure.
Make it quick.
Elaborate a little bit more on that nexus between demand and supply of labour, particularly in relation to the funding mechanism of vocational education training and how to achieve that nexus to be more focused on demand.
Yep.
Efficiency gain and educational services.
Sure. Look, that's the next frontier, if you like. How would you have a different funding model that would engage better with labour demand? And I think the key principle here has got to be giving funding priority to employers that have got together and are prepared to take collective responsibility for a failing in the training system. So the dairy farmers have got together and they've said, we can't solve this problem on our own. They're not parading up to government and say, fix it. They're saying, we're getting together and we're putting our own money in and we're building our own institutions. I think those kind of people deserve a lot of rewards. So, in a sense, you give rewards for collective self-reliance for overcoming a common property problem. I think that's design principle number one. The second thing is I think there should be co-payments. So I think where an employer puts a contribution in, then it's matched, and now there are going to be problems in some parts of the welfare sector where employers aren't flush with funds. So you can have a sliding scale. You can do this by industry. But I think it's well known that in some parts of the private sector they have used training funding to subsidise wages. I mean, I've looked at this in the security industry. If you set yourselves up with an RTO, you got your employer subsidy for a trainee, you could be paying $4.50 an hour. That was the motivation. They weren't upskilling the security workforce, they were just gaming the system. So for me, the object of funding should be building capability, right? It's not buying an outcome. Too many programs at the moment are based on the hairy-chested game, which state has got more trainees on the books. And any employer who puts their hands up and says, I'll take a trainee, then you throw money at them so they'll take the trainee so you can get up at a ministerial council meeting and say, we've got more trainees. I think that issue of employers who take collective responsibility and they put their own money into building up capacity, I think that's got to be the design principle for taking things forward. Now, that's not the only principle. I think there's also got to be a principle of basic core funding for a public provider to provide the backbone of these vocations. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be TAFE on its own. You know, in some parts of the care sector, groups like Lady Gowrie have immense standing as providers of quality vocational skills. And so I think what we should also be looking at is funding communities of trust. And you're not funding the individual employer, it's where all the players who are relevant to a vocation get together, they should be rewarded. But like I say, that's the next frontier and we're looking forward to trying to get a contract in that space. So.
Thank you very much, John. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank John Buchanan.
Thank you.